Welcome everybody to the Building a No Fuss Healthy Meal seminar. So I'm going to be presenting a little bit on how we can put together a meal that doesn't require as much stress and worry as often comes along with a lot of food concerns. I often find that that's a really big point of stress for people, is thinking about, you know, what is a healthy meal? How do I know if I'm eating the right thing? All of these different questions that pop up when we start to think about food preparation. So my name is Claire. I'm an accredited practicing dietitian at the Healthy Eating Clinic. And this is something that I work with clients with on a regular basis, that we sit down and we talk about, well, what are all the factors in my life that I'm trying to juggle? And how does food fit in with those things? And then how can I build a healthy meal based on those principles of nutrition without overthinking it, basically. So I'm going to share with you a presentation, and if you've got any questions along the way, definitely feel free to pop them into the group chat, or if you're watching this on Facebook at a later time, just pop them in the comments below, and I will coordinate and see if I can answer those as best as possible. So I'll share this PowerPoint with you now. Great. So essentially what we want to do is focus on, I'll move that one out of the way, is building a healthy meal using a couple of key nutrition principles. But I think it's good to remember that there is a lot of nutrition information out there. And if you're wanting to find something that's really specified to you and your requirements, given all of the factors of life, I definitely recommend seeking the help from an accredited practicing dietitian or an accredited or registered nutritionist. And these individuals are university qualified to provide nutrition information that's based on evidence, but it can also be tailored to your lifestyle, so it's individualized. And that's certainly where we come from here at the Healthy Eating Clinic and the Healthy Eating Hub, is that we want to take an evidence-based approach as much as possible, trusting in the science and what we know from the body of evidence. Before I get all the way into the nutrition advice, what I'd recommend is thinking about the food in a different way. A lot of the time our culture is brought up in the context of foods being good or bad, right or wrong. But when we look at it from a scientific perspective, food is just a bunch of chemicals. So food is just a bunch of nutrients that our body will break down and absorb, or that will pass through our body. And what we're trying to do when it comes to nutrition is just get our greatest nutrient bang for buck, rather than getting too bogged down in getting exactly the specifics of our nutrients. We want to just get the greatest variety from our food as efficiently as possible. So with that in mind, it's good to remember that nutrition requires context. So what's applicable to one person is not applicable to everyone. And that's why an individualized approach is usually the best thing we recommend. But if you do find along the way you're watching this and you have questions, just think about the context when you're phrasing a question, of rather than thinking about, well, is potatoes good or bad? Well, that depends. You know, it depends on what your goals are. It depends on how much you're having. It depends on what we have it with, and all of these sorts of factors that it depends on. So often the answer to simple nutrition questions is, well, it depends. So what I'd encourage you to do is think about the context of your nutrition question, and whether working with someone on an individual basis is probably the best approach. So when we think about healthy eating and we're trying to build this no fuss healthy meal, we've got to think a little bit about what's the point of healthy eating. And basically it comes down to four main things. One is to manage a healthy weight and to be able to sort of manage our energy intake and our body composition as a result. But that's quite a complex mix of different factors. But it's an important part of what food does, is we're giving fuel to our body. So part of the equation is managing a healthy weight. Another really big part is reducing our risk of developing chronic disease. So by giving our body all of the nutrients that it needs both now and as building blocks for the future, we can help to manage our risk of those chronic health issues, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and to a less direct linked effect is things like cancer. The other more immediate factors that we need our food for is to manage our appetite. And we know that when we're hungry, it's harder to concentrate, it's harder to manage our stress levels. And so getting enough fuel for our body is really important. But at the same time, we're also looking to boost our metabolism. So give our body enough fuel to do all the things that it wants to do. So these 4 things are really what healthy eating is trying to achieve. But how do we do that? And that's where we want to break it down to nutrition on my plate in the most no-fuss way, or in the simplest way possible. And to do that, to simplify it, we have to remember that we eat food, not nutrients. A lot of the nutrition information is focused on the nutrient, but when we put a meal together, we're putting foods together in a plate. So although we want to have an idea of the nutrients, getting too focused on the individual micro and macronutrients can be counterproductive to building that no-fuss sort of plan. So I'm just going to quickly check if we've got some more people joining, if you don't mind bearing with me for one moment. Beautiful. And we'll restart that one. Thanks, guys. So if we're trying to create a meal on our plate, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, we've got to break it down into our foods a little bit more so. So the next thing we want to consider is how we can do that. What food principles are really going to be valuable to build a no-fuss healthy meal? And that comes down to a couple of key things. And one of that is the whole foods, is that aiming to eat whole foods takes care of many of those factors when we were looking at chronic disease. So, or when we're looking at factors like energy management and chronic disease. Sorry, I'm getting all tongue-tied here, guys. So when we're eating whole foods, what it means is that we're eating minimally processed. There's less that's been added or taken away. And the food is fairly similar to how it was when it was picked from the farmer and then brought to you. The cool thing about whole foods is that they're nutrient dense. So we get lots of vitamins and minerals and fiber and all of those nutrients that we want for our body in one spot. And we get a huge variety from individual foods. So going for a whole food usually means we can worry less about those micronutrients because we're kind of covered in many ways. Then the other cool thing about whole foods is that usually to take a whole food, break it down and get those nutrients out of it, our body has to work a little harder. And there are components of whole foods that move all the way through your gastrointestinal system. And the key thing I'm thinking about there is fiber. And fiber becomes a really helpful tool in managing our appetite because we're able to have a large volume that's not going to overdo our kilojoule or calorie intake. So that dynamic between getting enough and not having too much is really easily taken care of just by focusing on whole foods. And that ties into this idea of nutrient density. So nutrient density is thinking about how much nutrient bang for buck am I getting? And we can look at that as a really nice example between an apple and a can of Coke. So one apple is about 100 calories. So if we were solely thinking about energy management and we compared it to a 250 mils of Coke, so that's one of those little cans, we'd actually get the same amount of energy. And if we were solely thinking about energy balance, then you kind of think, oh, well, it doesn't matter too much if I have the apple or the Coke. But when we start to look at nutrient density, we know that the apple gives us sugar and glucose, fiber, vitamin C, folate, and then a whole range of what's called phytochemicals and antioxidants. Compare that to our Coke, which is giving us just the sugar, essentially, no bonus nutrients. So when we're talking bang for our buck, it's clear that the apple is the winner when it comes to nutrient density. So that brings us to, okay, that principle of nutrition quality and nutrient density brings us to, well, how do I put that together into a meal really easily? And this is where something like the plate model becomes an incredibly valuable tool. And I do know that a lot of the time when I start to talk about the plate model, I can get a bit of an eye roll. And I fully get that. It's like, oh, I've seen this before. This is nothing new. But at the same time, why reinvent the wheel when this is really all we have to do to create a really no-fuss, well-balanced meal? what tends to happen is that we feel like there's got to be more to it. There's got to be a secret to it. But when we break it down into its individual parts of this plate model, you can see that that is the secret. The proportions and focusing on a couple of key elements when we're building a meal usually takes care of most of the worry. So the single most important thing we can do to build a no-fuss healthy meal is what's going on this left-hand side of the plate, which is our vegetables. And here we're talking about low starch vegetables or non-starchy vegetables. We would tend to group things like potato, sweet potato, and corn as starchy vegetables, as they have similar amounts of carbohydrate to volumes of rice and pasta. Whereas vegetables like carrot and parsnip and leafy greens and capsicum and mushrooms and all of these other vegetables are much lower in carbohydrate comparatively. And that becomes one of the single most effective ways to manage your appetite and have a voluminous meal without overdoing it from a kilojoule and calorie perspective. So fresh and frozen vegetables, even tinned vegetables, can be really handy. Fresh and frozen fruits are also what we tend to group in with that vegetable component. Then we start looking at the other half of the plate, and the key there is looking for high fiber sources of carbohydrate, and we'll go into that a little bit more. Lean sources of protein, and then whole food sources of fat as much as possible. And we also want to consider hydration as part of a balanced meal and as part of a balanced day. So these key things, this breakdown of pieces of the puzzle, is really all that it takes to build a healthy meal. And then it's about how we apply that. So to do that, we have to go from the food nutrients to thinking about the foods. So as I was saying, our vegetables are a great source of fiber, and they're very high in those nutrients, like that apple analogy: vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, plant stanols, sterols, antioxidants, all of these chemicals that do our body a lot of favors. And that then ends up meaning that we fill up our plate and load up with lots of volume, but because they're really rich in fiber, and fiber goes in one end and out the other, we're getting a lot of volume bang for a very minimal calorie buck. The other cool thing about vegetable, and that's this last point on this slide, is thinking about the fact that vegetables slow down your eating. It's really difficult to eat a salad with one hand while you're driving. And I think that's quite a valuable tool to think about, because when we slow down our rate of eating, we've got a little bit more opportunity to register our level of satiety. So it's easy when we're eating quickly or when we're eating meals while we're doing other things to not really register how much we've had. And I don't know if anybody's ever noticed that when you're having pizza in front of the TV, you can end up polishing off like a whole pizza before you even realize. And then afterwards, then you recognize how full you are. Like, oh my gosh, I went too hard. And that's really normal. Our body and our brain are distracted and focusing on other things, and we're eating quickly, quite high energy dense foods. So it takes a little while for your stomach to tell your brain that I'm full. So that's where vegetables become incredibly valuable and exciting. And I swear, I know it's probably pretty typical that the dietitian's obsessed with vegetables, but like, if there were one thing you took away from this whole chat, it would be like, non-starchy vegetables. How do I add them in, load it up more, get more of those? So the key principle we want to take when we're thinking about this is to fill half your plate. And if you're making a meal that's, say, a one-pot dish where everything's chucked in together, another nice way of thinking about it is loading up half the ingredients or half the weight volume of the meal. So for instance, I've made a spag bowl at home in the past, and I knew on this one particular occasion that I had the mince at home, and I knew I had the pasta at home. So I had to duck into the supermarket and get the vegetables. And I got a little bit overexcited, and I bought celery and tinned tomatoes and mushrooms and spinach and chucked in some capsicum, and I ended up walking out of the supermarket with a big basket of vegetables. And when I got home, that then took up far more volume on the table as I was chopping everything up, ready to go into the spaghetti bolognese, that I knew that each serve of that meal was going to end up with a high proportion of vegetables, and it will end up being half that volume or half that plate. So if you can, loading up with half a plate of vegetables is the single most effective way you know you're getting a no fuss healthy meal. The other cool things to think about when it comes to vegetable is considering the different types that we have across the day. I would tend to prioritize volume over variety to begin with. So if you really don't like lots of vegetables, that's okay. The ones that you do like, go to town with. But it's easy to become bored with the same vegetables over and over again. So planning in a bit of variety is a really valuable strategy. And color is a nice way to achieve that. So if you're thinking about when you're doing your grocery shop and you're getting a few different colors of different vegetables, it's a nice way to tick off the fact that you're going to be getting a range of different nutrients. And then the other thing to think about is varying up how you prepare them. I think for many people, we've grown up with our vegetables being prepared in one or two ways. For me, it was microwaved or roasted, and those were the only two ways that we really had vegetables. But there's so many different ways that we can prepare vegetables to make it interesting. And sometimes when you're thinking about, well, what meal am I going to cook? Searching for a vegetable recipe can be a really nice place to start, rather than going with just the carbohydrate or the protein to begin with. So some ideas and ways that you could mix up that cooking might be doing salads and keeping our vegetables raw and crunchy. As we get into the cooler weather, some other more like heated vegetable techniques might be more enjoyable. So there's nothing wrong with making a soup. And if your meal is a couple of pieces of toast and then a vegetable-based soup with some chicken stirred through or with some lentils or legumes within it, you've ticked those key boxes of the healthy plate model. Steamed vegetables is really great to still keep a bit of that crunch, and maybe even adding a sauce to once you've steamed your vegetables, even something as simple as a teriyaki marinade, or one of the ones we really like to do at home is some soy sauce mixed with some oyster sauce and a bit of garlic, and that popped through our steamed vegetables. Roasted and baked, this one's awesome because it's rare that you don't get a good roasted vegetable, unless you're roasting really watery vegetables like cucumber and lettuce, so don't do that. That will not be that nice. But roasted kale even is pretty good. So braised, now braised is when we tend to fry it off and brown things to begin with, and we add a little bit of liquid to slow cook it after that. And our root vegetables can be done quite well that way. Things like pumpkin, beetroot, carrot, giving them a good browning and then adding liquid to kind of cook them a bit further. Blanched is when we're just adding a bit of hot water or dipping our vegetables in hot water and then moving them to cold water so they stay really crisp. And this works well with things like broccoli and snow peas and green beans. Still gives your vegetable a nice crunch. Stir fry, again, relatively quick cooking at high heat to keep that crunch in your vegetable. And then saute is when we're looking to soften things down a lot more. So that's great for things like mushrooms. I'm quite a big fan of sauteing up tomatoes to make a bit of a pasta sauce. Go to town. So I think, yeah, the focus often on making sure we're getting enough vegetable, and then we're making it interesting so that it's enjoyable. And if you start the planning process or the decision-making process when it comes to your no-fuss meal of thinking of what vegetables have I got, or let's start with the vegetable and choose a cooking technique based on the vegetable, that's great. And there's a really nice way to reduce the decision fatigue. Then we want to think about our sources of protein. Now, proteins are quite an important component of most meals because protein slows our rate of digestion. So it allows you to feel full for a longer period of time. And it's also a vital building block for our own body tissues. Pretty much everything your body is made of is built from protein. Your hair, your skin, your nails, and particularly our muscles and our major organs need protein to rebuild and repair. It's also coincides, so we've got protein, which is the individual nutrient within protein-rich foods, but protein-rich foods come with a range of other vitamins and minerals. So for instance, red meat is what we would call a protein. It's a protein-rich food, but that's also got zinc and iron and B12 and a whole range of different nutrients within that. So we can't just drill down and focus solely on the one nutrient. We've got to think about all the benefits that we're getting from a particular food. Now, to simplify that, we want to think about, well, where can I get these wonderful sources of protein and these nutrients that go along with protein? And the big sources here are things like our animal-based products, so meat in the form of beef and lamb and pork, kangaroo, goat, our poultry, chicken, turkey, duck, all of those sorts of things, fish and the wide variety of fish that are available, as well as other forms of seafood, so calamari, prawns, those are my favorites, scallops, if you feel super fancy, eggs, and then also our dairy and our soy alternatives. So tofu and tempeh are drilled down from soybeans to create a rich protein alternative from a vegetable source. And then we've also got our whole legumes and beans. So things like beans and chickpeas and black beans and lentils are vegetables, but they're also pretty reasonable sources of protein and good alternatives if you are following a vegetarian diet. So then we've got to think about, well, how can we combine this into our meal? So if I've got my vegetables and I'm thinking about my vegetables and then I look at my protein, a lot of the time these things can go hand in hand. So a really quick and easy option can be doing a barbecue chicken from Woolworths or Coles, shredded up, and used in sandwiches or wraps and with salads. Baked or roast forms of meat. And I always like to think about, if I'm going to be baking or roasting one component of my meal, like the vegetables, I may as well do the protein in a similar way. And that cuts down on cooking and cleanup as well. Boiled eggs made into sandwiches, salads, eggs used in things like quiches, using frozen or fresh fish fillets, there's a tongue twister for you. And the more we can go for the unprocessed version of these foods, so the more we can choose an unbattered or an uncrumbed or our whole meats, rather than things like sausages and hams and processed versions, the more we're likely to get the benefit of all of those beautiful nutrients without additional salt, sugar, fat. Tuna or salmon in tinned form is really handy and quick and easy meal building block, or using things like 4-bean mixes in salads or in soups or in salads. Oh, I said that, sorry. Or even roasted is what I meant to say. Awesome. So we've got carbohydrates next. So if we thought back to that plate model, half the plate coming from vegetables, another key component being our protein. And then the next thing we want to think about is our source of carbohydrate. Now, at the moment out there in the media, carbohydrate gets a bit of a bad rap. And when we drill it down to think about the nutrient component, carbohydrates are not a bad thing. In fact, our body needs them to survive. The thing that tends to be troublesome when it comes to carbohydrate is that these are the bits in our meal that it's really easy to overdo. It's much easier to have a really large volume of pasta or a really large volume of potato and focus on our meat and our carbohydrate than thinking about the vegetable. And often the carbohydrate ends up displacing some of that really nutrient-rich vegetable. So I guess the thing we want to think about with carbohydrate is making sure that I feel comfortable including some. You absolutely can include carbohydrates, but just making sure that they're not then taking over the meal and that we're leveraging that vegetable to balance how much we're having of these things. The interesting thing about carbohydrate is that when we don't get enough, what can happen is that our body then seeks out glucose in more efficient forms or more quickly absorbed forms. So what I often see in practice is that when people try and dial back their carbohydrate intake, just have a salad with tin of tuna and then get through the afternoon, when they get to 3 or 4 o'clock, their brain is crying out for some glucose. And our brain then says to us, I want you to get me some glucose, but I want you to get it to me in the most efficient form you can, which is sugar. So off you go to the pantry and find me a packet of Tiny Teddies. Or maybe I'm looking for some chocolate at 3 p.m. mark. So by giving ourselves a bit of whole food source of carbohydrate, we can often better manage our appetite and better manage our craving for sugar. So where do we get this whole food source of carbohydrate? We can get that from a whole range of whole grain products and whole grains on their own. So whole meal and multigrain versions of breads and wraps and tortillas, pasta and couscous. You can even get high fiber versions of things like pasta and couscous. And there's more and more products coming out with different flours within the pasta that increase the fiber and make them even more beneficial for your body. So things like pulse pastas and lentil pastas, all these sorts of things. Grains like quinoa and oats, and then our breakfast cereals, high fiber breakfast cereals in particular. So we're thinking they're like muesli and branny style breakfast cereals rather than your Milo cereal and your Cocoa Pops and that kind of thing. Legumes, so things like beans and chickpeas and lentils, and then our starchy vegetables. As I mentioned earlier, our potato, our sweet potato, and our sweet corn, we tend to group as carbohydrate-rich foods, even though they are vegetables. So some ways we can include our carbohydrate within our main meals is things like wholemeal couscous with some roasted veg, cob of corn as a side dish. Using wholemeal and multigrain breads within a meal is totally reasonable. I even like to toast up a bit of bread and then chop it into croutons, and that can be a great thing to chuck into a warm salad. Wholemeal pasta in spaghetti bolognese, brown rice with our curries, or 4-bean mix within a salad or a soup. So adding some lentils or some soup mix to a soup can go a really long way to giving you a good whole food source of carbohydrate. So we've got our vegetables, we've got our carbohydrates, and we've got our proteins. The last thing we want to think about is getting a source of fat. And this is actually one of my favorite things to focus on because, let's face it, fat makes things taste good. When we think about fats, a lot of the time what can spring to mind is unhealthy, or what we group as unhealthy foods. But the reason they get branded unhealthy is just because they're energy dense. And if we were to solely eat those things, then yes, our calorie intake would clock up quite quickly. So a good example of that is cream. If you were to take a cup of cream, then you would end up with roughly about 300 to 400 calories. Whereas a cup of milk, which is a rich protein food as opposed to a fat food, is only about 80 calories. But the thing is that the texture of fats improves the palatability and the enjoyment of most of our meals. So if you think about adding a little bit of pesto to a pasta, that just makes it so much better. Or adding aioli to a salad, or using oil to roast your vegetables with, popping together some avocado in your burger. Like, all of these things enhance the enjoyment of food. And so using a little bit of fat is perfectly reasonable. It's just that we want to make sure that's in conjunction with lots of vegetables and then whole food protein and carbohydrate sources. So some great whole food sources of fat include things like avocado, nuts, seeds, oils, different spreads that you might cook with, so butter and margarine and peanut butter, but also things like dressings and sauces. So for instance, when we were talking about that sauce on your steamed vegetables of some oyster sauce and some soy sauce, a lot of the time the oil that we might add along with that, or that's part of that mix, is what gives it the palatability. So a little bit of that, if it helps me eat a lot of vegetable, great, go for it. And then when we think about creams, coconut milks, those sorts of things have the same palate enhancing textures. So what we can do to add this sort of pleasurability into a meal is using these sorts of things like avocado on a salad or a sandwich, adding nuts to different salads, or even adding a little bit of crunch to a pasta dish. Using, like if it was thinking about breakfast, using seeds within your breakfast cereal, but adding a little bit of oil and fat to a meal to make it more enjoyable, rather than feeling like you've got to face a whole plate of steamed veggies without anything to make it enjoyable. So this is now, we're taking those key principles of that plate model and putting that into some really simple, no fuss meals. So this is an example of one called nachos with a twist. And basically we're using some beef mince as our protein. And then mixed within that mince, we chuck in some 4-bean mix as our carbohydrate source. We can group the 4-bean mix as a protein, but because we've already got a protein from the beef mince, then our carbohydrate becomes, well, we use the 4-bean mix as our carbohydrate instead. We use a little bit of oil in the pan when we're cooking, but then we load the plate up with some tinned tomato goes into the sauce, grated carrot, shredded cabbage or something crunchy underneath, and then a bit of coriander to make it look beautiful. And for those of you who don't like coriander, that's okay. Some baby spinach would work. Then we've got something like this one where we've got some chicken that's been marinated in some herbs, and then that's made into a salad with some feta cheese as an additional protein source. Then we chuck in some tinged chickpeas, a little bit of avocado, and then loading the plate up mostly with lettuce, cucumber, and capsicum. So while lettuce, cucumber, and capsicum might not be super exciting on their own, when we've got the flavors and the textures coming from our protein, our carbohydrate, and our fat, we're much more able to enjoy that vegetable, but we still need it to be the predominant volume on the plate. Another really quick and easy example one is where we've got some chicken tenders as our protein and then some wholemeal couscous, really quick and easy to put together. In fact, you can do the chicken tenders on a toasted sandwich press, and while that's happening, you make your couscous, and then all we're doing is chucking that onto the plate with a leafy green mix. And that's a perfectly balanced meal with a little bit of avocado for that texture. And I think that's one of the things that we have to take the pressure off ourselves with, is just going with, have I got these main components there? Is it going to be something that I enjoy the taste of? Great, you've created a no fuss healthy meal. Take that pressure off yourself to create something MasterChef worthy. Another really great example of that is when we have taken something simple in terms of preparation style, like steamed green beans, steamed carrots, steamed broccoli, and then corn, but by using a fat source of some cream within the mushrooms, we add a really nice flavor and some texture that then you can use to make the whole plate more enjoyable. And there our protein source is coming from some chicken breast, which could be oven baked or pan fried. So you could pan fry your chicken and then take that out and chuck your mushrooms in, cook that up to make a sauce while your vegetables are steaming, and you've got a perfectly balanced meal. So then what we've got here is a few more really simple ideas to create a balanced meal, where we're talking things you can keep stocked in the pantry or put together with minimal prep. So some tuna with a really nice flavor. I'm quite a big fan of teriyaki added to your tuna, with some steamed fresh bags and then an instant cup of rice. Bam, you've got a healthy, no fuss meal. Or it could be putting together a barbecue chicken wrap. And a lot of the time we sort of see this as well, that could be a lunch or something you take to a picnic, but this works really well just for a dinner. Or if you've got a couple of days in a row where you know you're going to be really busy and you just want to have something that's ready to pop together when you get home, certainly nothing wrong with this kind of combination. It ticks all the boxes. Or even giving ourselves the permission to include something that may be a bit more processed, if it's the difference between me doing something at home and preparing something with a little bit of vegetable. So we've got here some beans and broccoli and sugar snap peas to add in. If it's going to be the difference between that and getting takeaway, this is still going to be a better choice because of that volume of vegetable. So in many ways, it can be at looking at the lesser between a few evils. I'm just going, well, it might be a slightly more processed food product. There might be some more packaging there, but if it means that I'm choosing that over feeling like I have to get takeaway, this is still a really great, no fuss, healthy meal. I also like to give myself permission to have a day where I'm not cooking and feel like I can void the adult duties for a little bit. And this is a really nice way to do that, of just putting together a tasting plate, because even within this, we've got the key components of a balanced meal. Lots of vegetable being the #1 principle. And then we've got some fat coming from our olive dip, and our protein includes some prosciutto. Now this template doesn't necessarily include that carbohydrate component, but you could quite easily add that in by adding maybe 10 to 12 crackers as being the additional section. Oh, so we've just got another participant joining. Beautiful. So this is another example meal. Now, this is a tool that I find really helps to take the fuss out of the meal planning process or out of the decision making when it comes to lunch or dinner. And that is when, oh, beg my pardon, we break it down into these components and can do a mix and match. So up the top here in the very top row, we've got our sources of protein, and these are all pretty reasonable portions for an adult. And then as we step further down, we've got carbohydrates and our fats and then our vegetables. Now, there's no one right way. You could start with your vegetables if you wanted to. But I think just breaking it down into its individual components means that we can create a meal just with these bits and pieces and know that it's balanced. So for instance, you could be thinking about, well, what am I going to do for dinner tonight? Well, I've certainly got some chicken in the fridge maybe. Great, okay, there's my starting point. I'm going to have some 150 grams of chicken, which is roughly about half a chicken breast. I'm going to use that chicken breast and I'm going to chuck that in with maybe some tinned chickpeas that I've got left over from that I've got stored in the pantry. Or you might not be feeling anything that's in the pantry, so you decide, okay, yep, I'm going to go out and I'm going to grab some sweet potato. So I'm going to do chicken and sweet potato, and then maybe with that I'll use some pine nuts as my as my fat source. So I've got the key components of chicken, sweet potato, pine nuts, and I feel like, I could probably roast these pretty easily. So if I chuck my chicken and my sweet potato in the oven to roast it, I may as well roast other vegetables while I'm there. So maybe that's just picking a few vegetables that are more suitable to roasting. So some of the ones that aren't listed here could include things like beetroot and carrot and red onion and capsicum and zucchini. So just going with, yeah, those are all vegetables I can roast, and then I can put it all in one step and it doesn't require lots of preparation. If I wanted to, then you could put that on top of a leafy green mix. So maybe it means that my meal becomes some oven-baked chicken with oven-baked sweet potato, beetroot and pumpkin, and some pine nuts just toast ready to be sprinkled on top, all of that on top of a leafy green mix. Done. Very, very kind of simple without having to go search for a specific recipe. And I think that's the thing with making it no fuss, is not looking for a specific recipe, but breaking it down into its key components. And that, I suppose, brings us to the key to really making a meal no fuss is understanding that we are busy, and even in spite of the changes that have gone on with COVID, we're still really busy, if not more so, because our mental load is higher. And I think there are a couple of very simple steps you can take to make the meal or the whole dynamic of nutrition and the whole dynamic of meals a lot simpler. And those come down to, one, writing a little bit of a plan. May not have to be for the whole week, but if you've got a few meals in mind ahead of time, then you then don't have to think about it over and over and over again throughout the day. I know that if I don't have a meal planned for the day, I will spend like the whole day or incrementally throughout the day, I'll find myself thinking, what are we doing for dinner tonight? What are we doing for dinner tomorrow? And then I've got to think about, what have we got in the fridge? What have we got in the pantry? What have I got to get on the way home? Are they going to have that in stock? Do we have enough money for that? Is that something that everybody's going to eat? Is that going to do me for lunch tomorrow? Is that even healthy? So many questions that then we start drilling into. And then I can even make a decision about it and be like, right, cool, I'm going to have some chicken and some sweet potato and some roasted veg on leafy greens. Done. And if I haven't written it down, I will then come back to that question 4 hours later and be like, no, what am I doing for food tonight? And then I'll have exactly the same conversation. And that's a whole lot of mental energy that could be far better spent on more fun things or more productive things. So having a bit of a plan, making a shopping list. Now that we've got online shopping more accessible again, potentially shopping online or doing click and collect, something to make it more efficient. Utilizing bulk cooking, so doing a big cook up can be a really good way to go. So with that chicken and sweet potato example, if I did more than I needed, I've then got leftovers I can reuse and simplify that process. But I think it's also good to focus on all the factors that influence our food choice. And a big one of that is taking a bit of a break, and giving ourselves the time and space to think about this kind of thing. A lot of the time we don't think about nutrition until we get to that moment, until it gets to 5 o'clock and you're like, oh, what am I going to do for dinner? But giving yourself a bit of a buffer, a bit of time just to make a plan can go a really long way to lessening that mental load and lessening that sense of reactive decision making when it comes to food. So that brings us to the end of the principles of building a no-fuss healthy meal. If you've got questions around this, you can absolutely comment in the Facebook chat and I will coordinate giving some answers, providing some answers. But you can also contact us at the Healthy Eating Hub. Our website is healthyeatinghub.com.au, and we're also on Facebook and Instagram. So you're more than welcome to connect with us that way. Ask us questions through those channels, get in contact with our practitioners. And yeah, particularly if you've got challenges that you're facing in your circumstances, we're really happy to help problem solve and figure things out around that. So as I bring my face back, I wanted to check in and see if there were any questions that have popped up as we've been talking. Did anybody who's participating now have a question for me while we're here?
I was just wondering more about vegetarian and vegan diets and how that protein component fits in.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. More and more people are choosing to have a meat-free and a vegetarian or vegan perspective. In which case we can use very similar principles. It's just about making sure that we do include as much as possible, a vegetarian or vegan protein option. So some really good ones and whole food ones that we can easily refer to are those legumes and beans. And that might mean thinking about making a bean patty for a burger, or popping beans into a casserole, or roasting some chickpeas as we might roast other vegetables. So certainly using those whole food vegetarian sources of protein are really good. Some slightly more processed options include our tofu and our tempeh, and they can be really great things to include within that meal planning process. If I'm going to be popping together a meal, can I use tofu, like some firm and marinated tofu, to add both the fat and the protein component of that meal? So one of the ones that I'm a big fan of is doing like satay marinated tofu in a bowl with maybe some, beg my pardon, some noodles. So doing like packet of noodles, 2-minute noodles, or rice noodles, but then making sure that we bulk up the vegetable in with that. So that might mean peeling up some carrots so that becomes a noodle consistency, popping it on top of some bean sprouts and leafy green mix. Or I'm a bit of a fan of beetroot at the moment, so it might be serving it up with some beetroot. So as long as you've got those key components there, there are quite a lot of vegetarian and vegan based alternatives that you can use and interchange with that protein section. Having said that, sometimes that can limit our choices a little bit. So you could be cycling through as a vegetarian eggs and tofu and corn products, or a veggie patty or something like that, and then feel a little bit limited in your variety. In which case, I'd suggest that half of the plate that was divided up with carbs and proteins and fats, you've got a bit more flexibility there to have variety in the portions of that. So what I mean by that is that if you were putting together a pasta meal and you really just couldn't think of a protein source that's going in there, that's okay for that meal. for it to be half a plate of carbohydrate, as long as we've still got that half a plate of vegetable, which will help to increase the nutrient density and manage the energy density of the meal. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does. I've recently decided to go vegan, and a lot of people have asked me, how do vegans get protein? And so I'm just sort of learning about that myself.
Yeah, and there are, I hope you're finding lots of possible options when it comes to vegan diets. I think the key when it comes to a vegan diet and meeting that protein need is actually the variety of sources. So that ties in, we're getting a little bit more nerdy with nutrition information, but bear with me. So a lot of our plant-based sources of protein have some, but not all, of our essential amino acids. So when we eat animal-based products and animal tissue, we're getting all of those essential amino acids in one spot. If you were to have eggs, even, that would have all your essential amino acids in one spot. But for things like beans, peas, lentils, chickpeas, all of these variants and vegetarian or vegetable-based sources of protein, we only get a selection of those amino acids. And it's by combining a number of different sources of those proteins within our day, within our week, you'll still get all of the essential amino acids that you need. It's just a matter of getting variety through that process.
Oh, thank you.
No worries. Any other questions at this stage?
That was all from me. Thank you.
Love it. Awesome. Well, what I might do is we'll wrap up there as the kind of guts of the topic. But what I will continue to do is keep an eye on the ANU Sports Facebook page. And if you're seeing this after the fact, I will do my very best to answer any questions that are written in there. But you can also email me if you have a really burning question that you don't want to pop on social media. Just pop that through to Claire, which is CLARE.Wolski, WOLSKI, at healthyeatingclinic.com.au. But it was really nice delivering this chat, and I hope if you're watching this later you enjoy the contents, or if you've got any feedback, let me know. But I'm also really excited to do the next one on Thursday. We're going to be chatting a little bit more about the planning process and juggling healthy eating within a family and all of the competing needs that affect that. So these are the principles, and then we're going to chat more about how we do it in the busyness of life. Awesome. So I'll catch you later, guys. Thanks very much for having me.
Bye.